emotions.
The following story is an excerpt from The Existence Project, a creative storytelling workshop in Victoria, British Columbia, giving voice to whole communities, with and without lived experience of homelessness, to create, connect, and share around the common intersection of poverty, mental health, and stigma in our lives. Kahn is an artist and student of creative culture. Ali's path into the Canadian art community has been as unconventional as his work. His dedication to fellow artists brought opportunities to organize independent art events, international painting tournaments, and travel Canada while hosting shows. With lifelong experience of poverty and mental health challenges, Ali works to empathize with others by first understanding himself, sharing in stories of success and failure along the way. He is currently the creative director of The Existence Project, guiding narratives and content from our workshops into the public eye.
My name's Ali. Thank you very much for being here, and I think this is one of the fuller rooms that I've experienced here, so I am kind of nervous. Please bear with me if I go off on a tangent. What I'd like to talk about today is going to be sort of my mental health history and the effect that's sort of had on my social situation and my housing and financial situation in my life, and sort of where that came from. And yeah, it's difficult to share these kind of stories. For me, my understanding of my mental health history and substance abuse history and homelessness history is sort of intertwined. They're not really separate things. And so it's taken me a long time to kind of unpack and unweave that and have a better understanding of it. I guess I'll start from so that's kind of what I'm going to focus on today. If anybody's like triggered by my conversation about mental health, feel free to raise your hand. Or I guess I'll start from what the diagnosis I was given is. I think it's a good place to start just because it's helped me understand things, even though for me a diagnosis is kind of like a fluid thing. It's helped me understand better what I'm dealing with, but it's also evolved over time, and I think it might continue to do that. So I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and PTSD, which is a really umbrella term. Sometimes for me, a lot of that came from early childhood, and sometimes people call that complex PTSD, although it's not really a diagnosis that I think the Canadian system acknowledges yet, but some other systems are. And I've had a lot of people question pretty specifically whether or not I have ADHD, but yeah, for me those diagnoses help sort of guide an understanding of the symptoms I experience and the effects that they've had on me. I don't like to think of them quite as definite things. I think the first time I'd say that my mental health condition started when I was quite young. I grew up in what I think most people would describe as a fairly violent and chaotic environment, and I was really young when that started happening. Probably around, I would say that the things that contributed to the chaos and violence in my life when I was growing up probably started happening around the time when I was maybe 5 years old. So when early development was going on, that's when a lot of the family violence started happening. And when I was 8 years old, my parents divorced, again under I'm not going to go all into it, but fairly contentious and violent process that was protracted over a year and a half or so. And that was my first interaction with mental health assessment when I was, I think, about 8. The family services child custody process had me go and me and my 2 siblings go and speak with counselors. Only one of us was only 2 of us were really old enough to go and talk with them. But during that time, I was what I understand now to be sort of trained to ignore certain questions and trained to give answers on certain things that weren't the truth in order to have a specific custody outcome for my primary parent, which was my mother. So a lot of my really initial interactions with a counselor or somebody like that from about 8 years old, I was trained, don't trust these people. If you say the wrong thing, you'll be sent to foster homes. Like you and your siblings are going to get split up. So you got to say this, you got to say this. So I was trained to sort of mistrust people in a counseling setting, and that persisted throughout my youth. So I had access to counselors through school and stuff like that. They knew sort of what my family was dealing with, but I never disclosed anything real to them other than what they knew. And to some degree, as a result of that, this was also, maybe over 20 years ago, the education even from counselors around different mental health issues wasn't quite what it is today, maybe. So the things that you would see as mental health conditions that I experienced, I know from a very young age, like as far back as 12, I can remember having long-form, episodes of depression, having social anxiety. Regardless of what was going on in my home, I also experienced a lot of like bullying at school and stuff like that. So I remember experiencing what we think of as symptoms of like social anxiety and depression from a very young age. But my frame of reference for understanding that came largely from within my family, and in my family, because there was to some degree a religious background and a really old school approach to dealing with mental health concerns. A lot of my understanding was wrapped up in this idea that if somebody was experiencing this kind of stuff, it attributed to like a spiritual, like some sort of a spiritual deficiency or weakness of character or laziness or this kind of thing. So there wasn't really a place to describe the symptoms I was experiencing in a medical way. And I think for me that was generational. Part of the experience for me was that my primary parent had, as also from earlier on, but specifically as a result of this contentious divorce, had a serious mental health issue that I sort of lived with as I was growing up. So they didn't have, generationally, there hadn't been an addressment that there was mental health conditions in my family that actually, when I researched it later, went back some 3 generations to my great-grandmother, who, to the best of my understanding now, committed suicide because she was a morphine addict. And this was like my great-grandmother. So that these kind of things had existed in my family, but we didn't talk about it really. We talked about it in a context of, sort of social isolation and stuff like this, and I didn't really have a good understanding of it. At the same time as that, one of the things that can make it difficult to access and understand mental health issues is poverty, and that was another thing that sort of layered on top that my family experienced when I grew up. Most of the time, my family was on the social assistance system, so we were pretty careful about talking about stuff in general, but we didn't have the resources to talk to a counselor or have professional support or something like that. So it also created, I would say, feelings. Being on the social assistance system growing up creates a lot of feelings of shame and guilt when you're interacting with other people that sort of reinforce I'm not going to talk about what's going on with me. I'm not going to really tell even my friends about it, even my closest friends. So I sort of, what I see as the effects of depression and anxiety and PTSD dominantly on my life has been a difficulty maintaining long-term relationships, a difficulty building trust with people, feeling safe enough to talk about what it is I'm dealing with, and then managing my own life. And the difficulty in like sort of maintaining the technical things and papers that you need to keep above water. I've had difficulty with that pretty much my whole life. When I turned 32, that was the first time that I can say that I really looked at whether or not I had a mental health issue and went out to seek help for it. So I lived during that time dealing with the effects of depression, in a lot of different ways. I self-medicated, used different substances. I'm not going to get into what they were necessarily, but different ones at different times, and always as a way to treat or to somehow get past episodes of social isolation, of like ongoing depression, and just to cope. And it made dealing with the symptoms and conditions even more difficult, and didn't bring me any closer to seeking the help I need. When I was 32, I was in Ontario. That has been like probably the event that kicked off my learning how to access resources recently. I had what was basically a sustained depressive episode. It affected my relationships. I'd been in a long-term relationship that ended. I had been working with some people, and it affected my employment relationships. I quit my work. I had not maintained any of my finances. During that time, what I had done is went to a walk-in clinic, talked to a doctor about the depression and anxiety that I was experiencing, and I was referred to KMH, which is the Center for Addictions and Mental Health in Toronto. I was given, after talking to a psychologist for about an hour, I was given an assessment of major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. I was prescribed Zoloft, and although I'm not going to say that talking to a doctor and getting medication for a mental health issue is, for some people that really works. My understanding today is that the medication regime around mental health issues is part sort of art and guesswork and part science in almost equal measure. And so I had just waited a long time to talk about the underlying issues. PTSD wasn't something that had come up yet. My family history wasn't something that was well documented. So I was given a fairly high dosage really quickly and wasn't hugely supervised on it. So my response to that was basically what I now understand was a sustained sort of long-term hypomania. And I basically started making incredibly rash decisions. I blew through what was remaining of my finances. I was experiencing paranoias, like some of the classic paranoias, sort of sitting in my house waiting for the red dots to come through the windows kind of stuff. Seems kind of funny, but at the time it was really crippling. It made it difficult for me to go outside and talk to people. And when I did talk to people, especially within my own family, because there wasn't an education for them about what mental health issues really were, they didn't understand at all what I was dealing with. And their response to it, although I won't get into it, sort of made it more difficult for me to recover, partly because they just didn't understand what I was going through, so it made them frustrated and angry that I was making these bad choices, and they weren't around. They were on the West Coast. One of the things I did was I came out here to try to get help from them and start the healing process again. When I came out here, I was still in a hypomanic state, so I made even more bad decisions, and I ended up in Victoria, and which I didn't plan coming to. I think that for me, that was one of the characteristics of my hypomania was I would just pack my shit basically and run. And so I ended up, after not very long, homeless on the streets here in Victoria. It's not the first time I've been homeless. That has happened, at least half a dozen times in my life. But this is the first time that I was outside without a plan and because of the hypomania, I really didn't have an ability to understand what my situation was. One of the effects of that the medication had on me, when I should say I had this hypomanic response, I came off the medication under the advice of Sunnybrook Hospital, but I came off too quickly. And so I went from a fairly high dosage down to nothing. And I basically, during that time, I had lost a significant amount of weight, maybe 40 pounds. And some of what I now understand are like my working memory and cognitive functions. I've always thought of myself as an intelligent person. I got good grades in school and stuff like that, but I couldn't do things like read more than a paragraph. I couldn't. If a form was in front of me, it was incredibly difficult for me to understand. So when I came out here, navigating the system of like needing to get onto social assistance, interacting with shelter supports and stuff like that became just really difficult because I didn't know how to fill out the necessary paperwork. And in my hypomania, I had managed to lose a bunch of the documents that I needed. So I started from being on the mats at the first Met. I ended up at Rock Bay Shelter. I was there for about a month and a half, and that's when I started to get set up with some supports, and then I got into Animal House. I was probably here 2 or 3 months before my mania subsided. And during that time, I got set up with some supports. For me, the most important intervention was counseling. That's one of the things that I got access to when I came here that I really, because of my childhood introduction to it, had serious mistrust about. Mm-hmm. So for the last, I'd say, year, I've had the ability to go and see a counselor every week. And it's the first time that I started to really look at and try to educate myself about the nature of the mental health conditions that I experience, and talk about how they came to be in my life, how far back they go, and learn some ways that I can cope with the symptoms of them and still make slow, consistent progress. Being a resident in Animal House gave me a safe place that I could stay and could separate myself from the temptations that were there when I was on the street from different substances and stuff that I'd had and had a pattern of using in the past. So I would say one of the things that I learned for myself is that society holds certain stigmas around mental health that make it difficult for us to talk about these kind of things, and made it difficult for me to talk about it, not just with my family, but with people in general. But the process of talking about it is what's given me an ability to develop some community ties, develop some resources, and understand what I can do to, in terms of self-care, to make sure that I don't have these, these serious responses that end me up back to the street again, basically. At the same time, within my own mind, the stigmas that I grew up with made it difficult for me to admit that I was dealing with the conditions that I was and ask properly for what I needed. I think the process of counseling is what helped me get to a place where I could be less judgmental on myself for having the conditions that I have. Today, I don't use medication as a way to deal with my particular conditions. I don't necessarily advocate that for anybody. If medication's a part of their regime that helps, I think that's important. But for me, I've sort of focused on mindfulness techniques and things like artwork. I know that this is not really recordable, but just as an example of something that I do to deal with a depressive episode, I have this kind of detailed drawing of flowers that's a pattern. That's an example of the kind of thing that I can do, that is a skill that I have that helps me deal with a depressive episode. Different people have different strategies. Some people really need to talk with people about it. That's something that I do on an ongoing basis. And then, having things that I can do in my own time on my own to deal with something to get me out of a funk, that is also something that has been really important for me. So artwork in a therapeutic capacity has really helped me deal with, sort of express the emotions behind what I'm feeling and guide myself in a healthier direction. I think for myself, one of the biggest things that has changed for me over the past year has been I've really found a hopefulness that I can rebuild a future that I'm excited about and that I can contribute back to society again. The combination of dealing with mental health issues and being in a position of poverty can sort of be self-reinforcing. And although I've needed to access public funds and services to maintain my safety, the fact that I'm having an opportunity to deal with the underlying issues that sort of caused a lot of my that caused a lot of my mental health conditions, to me is an opportunity to break the cycle and to not make some of the mistakes that I've made in the past, have more supports that help me with the organization, the planning of my life so that I don't end up in the crisis situations that I have before, and hopefully what will let me break the cycle of ending up homeless. But yeah, for me, I think the most important thing is in talking about this, I would hope that younger people have an opportunity to feel like they can talk about this kind of stuff. I think a lot of people are open to the idea that they can learn more about it, but if we talk mostly to a younger generation, that's how change will happen over time, and the discussion around these kind of things will be a little bit more normalized in families. So if people are dealing with this kind of stuff at a young age, then they have the ability to head it off before it sort of has a sustained effect like it did on my life. But yeah, I would say that over the last year I've been really hopeful. I've made a lot of progress in terms of getting myself into a healthy situation and facing some of my social anxiety, going back and volunteering and then starting to do work again. And I think that open discussion like this is what's going to give more people like me an opportunity to get their lives back on track and break the cycles that have existed and have a successful future. So that's my story.